thank you so much for joining us today at Phytopia. Thank you for taking the time to join us this evening for the Gilded Canopy, which is a talk, a part of the series of public lectures and discussions organized by Science Gallery Bengaluru for its first digital exhibition, Phytopia. Science Gallery Bengaluru is a public institution for research-based engagement. Phytopia is our first digital exhibition and marks the International Year of Plant Health. At Phytopia, we bring together engineers, scientists, designers, artists, and biohackers to create an experience where you can explore and experiment beyond the kitchen, the lab, and the farm. We would like to thank the Natural History Museum, London, and the National Centre for Biological Sciences for their support in making today's event possible. Now I'd like to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Sandra Knapp. Sandra, or Sandy, is a botanist who specializes in the taxonomy and evolution of the nightshade family and has spent much time in the field collecting plants, mostly in South America. She works at the Natural History Museum, London, where she arrived in 1992 to manage the international project Flora Mesoamericana, a synoptic Spanish language inventory of approximately 18,000 species of plants of southern Mexico and the Isthmus of Central America. She is also the author of several popular books on the history of science and botanical exploration, including the award-winning Potted Histories and more than 200 peer-reviewed scientific papers. She is actively involved in promoting the role of taxonomy and the importance of science worldwide. Sandy is a trustee of several conservation and scientific organizations, and in May 2018 took the office as the president of the Linnean Society of London. In 2009, she was honored by Peter Raven Outreach Award by the American Society of Plant Taxonomists for her work in public engagement with science. Today's talk will be an interesting exploration of the Natural History Museum in London, not its collections, but the building itself. Highly decorated throughout with motifs and casts of animals and plants, it has been likened to a cathedral to natural history. Throughout the terracotta facings on the building, inside and out, the architect Alfred Waterhouse placed images of animals, both living and extinct, on most of the available surface. Plants provide the decorative elements everywhere except the ceilings, where they are the stars of the show. The vaulted ceilings of the main hall are composed of panels illustrating a wide variety of plants from all over the world. Why these plants? Where did these images come from? What do they say about the world at the time the museum in London was built? Sandy's talk is going to address all these questions and more. Together with Sandy, we hope to explore these stories and see how the world has changed since the days the museum first opened its doors to the public. I would now hand over the session to Sandy, and I would like to remind the audience to keep putting your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will have at least 15 minutes or more to discuss all your questions at the end of the session. So, Sandy.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay, that looks like it's worked. Thank you very, very much. And thanks so much for the invitation to come and talk today. I never thought I would actually like giving talks virtually like this because I quite like seeing people and seeing how they react. But actually, it's quite exciting because I can go places which I perhaps wouldn't have had an opportunity to go in the normal run of things. I could have never come to India for a one afternoon talk, whereas now I can. So I feel like I'm in India. So thanks everybody for coming. My details are there at the bottom of the screen. Now, the Natural History Museum in London is one of London's, they call it one of London's iconic buildings. It is an extraordinary building. And it first opened its doors to the public in 1881. So it's been around for quite a long time. This is a picture taken by our Director of Science during our lockdown, which means there was no traffic on the road in front of it, which is a very unusual circumstance. Now, the museum is the brainchild of Richard Owen, who was the superintendent of natural history at the museum in the middle part of the 19th century. And the museum was originally part of the British Museum, which was founded on the collections of Sir Hans Sloan, which I'll come to in a little while. And Richard Owen, he was the president of the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1858, and this is what he said in his address. He said, "The most essential to rendering the collections of this great empire is space. and the collections ought to be in a state conducive to the advancement of philosophical zoology and on a scale commensurate with the greatness of the nation and the peculiar national facilities for such perfection. Now you can see here in this quote, actually, what Britain thought of itself at that time that the museum was built. And just keep that in mind as we go through thinking about these images, because this is an important aspect of why the museum's decoration is the way it is, and also why the museum was constructed in the way it was. Now, in 1864, Owen actually got his way, and the building was approved by the government, and the funds were raised by a national lottery to build a new natural history museum. A competition was held for the design of the museum, and it was won by an architect called Francis Fawkes, who promptly, several months later, died, not because he won the competition, but that was purely a circumstance. So he died, and then the commission to build the building was given to a young, up-and-coming architect from Manchester in the north of England called Alfred Waterhouse. And this is one of Waterhouse's original sketches for the building that became the Natural History Museum. And you'll see how it's a little bit different. It's a bit grander in this conception than it actually turned out to be. And this is one of the places where they thought it might be, which is along the embankment, along the River Thames. But actually, South Kensington was chosen as the site for the Natural History Museum in 1864 when construction was started. And this is a postcard from around the time that the museum opened. And you can see that the design of the museum with this big cathedral-like hall, these two kind of side arms, and then lots of galleries going back. And this is essentially what the museum looks like today with some additions here. But South Kensington today is a very urban area with lots of traffic, lots of houses, lots of buildings. But at the time that the museum was built, it was basically empty. There was a rather ugly building that had been put up for the Royal Exhibition. Now, one of the things that Waterhouse did is he designed the building to be decorated, as was said in the introduction. And what he did is he decorated the western side of the building, this side of the building, with extant animals that are living, and this side with extinct animals. And these are some of his drawings of extant animals, a lion, and extinct animals, a saber-toothed tiger, with which he decorated the facade of the building. When it opened to the public, the reviews panned the architecture. They said that the building was ornamented, if it may so term, both externally and internally, with incorrect and grotesque representations of animals, the style of building being more adapted to a suburban tea garden than to a national museum. So basically, the reviewers didn't like the ornamentation, but the ornamentation pervades the building and is now part of its real charm and allows us to think about the building in a completely different way than had the building been completely unornamented. This is the very first building that Alfred Waterhouse clad entirely in terracotta, which is baked clay. These animals and pillars look like stone, but they're actually clay, and it's terracotta, which was partly in vogue at the time as fireproofing for these large public municipal buildings. So outside, this is one of the pterodactyls from the eastern side, the eastern facade of the building, but it's also ornamented entirely with terracotta on the inside. And across some of the big arches, which I'll show you in a minute, there are monkeys which go up all of the sides, and each of these monkeys has a different expression and is doing something ever so slightly different. So I've worked at the Natural History Museum for more than 20 years, and every time I walk through this building, I see something new and something different, which makes it a really exciting place to work. So when you look at these panels of decorations all around the museum, you can see that they're mostly focused on the animals, and they're focused on animals doing things, rabbits hiding behind vegetation, herons feeding each other fish. And plants feature in all of these, but nowhere are they actually the center of attention. The eye is drawn to the animals, and the animals were what were important to Richard Owen. Richard Owen was a zoologist and surely had something to say about what went into the decoration of the building, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But the only place where plants are actually the star of the show in the museum is on the big vaulted ceiling in that central hall which ran down the center of the building. which is a ceiling which is 30 meters above the ground. And this is a picture from lying on the ground looking up at the ceiling. So we know very little about this ceiling. We know very little about who designed it. Almost certainly it was Alfred Waterhouse. We know a little bit about what it was intended to be like from this one article in the British Architect, in the magazine, The British Architect and Northern Engineer, which says the lower panels will have representations of foliage treated conventionally. The upper panels, these up here, will be treated with more variety of color, and the designs will be of an archaic character, whatever that means. The chief idea to be represented is that of growth. The colors will be arranged so that the most brilliant will be near the apex of the roof. And I'll leave it to you to think about as we go through these images whether actually that was achieved. So we know that there was an idea about growth. There was an idea about the growth being represented in the panels of the ceiling. We know that the panels were executed by the firm Best and Lee, who were also from Manchester, and the artist was Charles James Lee. But what we don't know is how he did it. Another thing we do know about the ceiling is that it was value engineered. You know, when you have big building projects, oftentimes the costs get cut, so parts of them get taken away from the ultimate kind of execution of the building. And the painted ceilings were one of the things that got cut from the original design of the Natural History Museum. But by some hook or crook, Alfred Waterhouse managed to convince the powers that be, which was the treasury at the time, so this is the government coffers, managed to convince them that it would be much easier to actually paint the ceiling with plants while the scaffolding was up, rather than take the scaffolding down and have to put it back up again and paint it later. So he managed by dint of argument, and it must have been quite a clever argument, to actually get the ceilings reinstituted into the design of the museum. So we think that almost certainly that the ceilings were painted from scaffolding in situ on plaster, because all of the panels are painted on plaster. And here's a picture, a recent picture taken when some renovations were being undertaken on the ceiling, someone painting on plaster, a bit like Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling, except a bit different. So when you look at that ceiling, think about that as being painted in situ to be seen from 30 meters below. So this is the ceiling is essentially divided into three parts, and I'll go through those three parts separately. The first of which is this central hall, which has these panels depicting growth. There's another part which is above a landing, which I'll talk about, and then another part in what's called the North Hall, which is a different part of the building. So there are painted ceilings in all three of these places. Now you can see these ceilings really well now that Hope the Whale has been hung in the central hall, and I'll talk about her in a minute. The paintings are actually remarkably detailed for being seen from 30 meters below. From 30 meters below, you don't need to have a lot of detail because you can't see it. And so they're essentially painted in four colors. They're red, pale green, dark green, and then there's gold leaf, which is put on the paintings, on the plaster. And you can see that they're very schematic. They're very schematic drawings, but they do look nice from a long way below. So some of these paintings, actually, here's a panel which is the paintings to depict growth. So what these did is the central stem would start out in the middle. So they're not botanically very accurate. They all look basically exactly the same. They start in the middle, and then the branches grow out into the 6 panels. And we thought a long time about how did they choose the plants to go on the ceiling? And that's been a question that people have wondered about since there's no documentation about how they chose the panels to go on the ceiling. And I'll let you in on some of the things that we discovered or some of the things that we speculate. And in this main part of the hall, the panels look as though they were selected to be both familiar and unfamiliar. So this is an apple tree. There are also British trees, which Victorian visitors to the museum from Britain would have recognized at the time, things like oaks. There are also, and you can see here, exactly the same sort of form, but different leaves, and you can see the acorns. There are also plants which are plants that would have been familiar to Victorian people at the time, who would have been familiar with plants of the Bible. Things like vines, grapes, figs, and also some other things. Now, there are a couple of these big panels on the ceiling which we think are possibly tributes to some of the men, and they were always men, whose collections started out at the Natural History Museum. And one of these people is Sir Hans Sloan, who you may have heard that his statue in the British Museum, which is where the Natural History Museum was originally part, has been moved and put into the context of his involvement in the slave trade, which is a really important thing that many museums around the world are doing to acknowledge the history that we have and the history of exploitation that sometimes goes with the building of these large museums. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. Sloan was the physician to the Governor General of Jamaica in 1680 and wrote a book when he came back, which has this extraordinary title. It's A Voyage to the Islands of Madeira, Barbados, Nieve, St. Christopher's, and Jamaica with the natural history of blah, 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 blah. So this has got to be one of the longest book titles of all time. But he wrote this book, and he was known for being a collector and being a physician to the aristocracy. But he was also known at the time for having brought back a recipe for chocolate, which then became commercialized. Later, this recipe was bought by Cadbury's and has become started off the Cadbury chocolate empire. But it's called Sir Hans Sloan milk chocolate. So Sloan was sort of associated with chocolate. And we think that this panel on the main ceiling, which is Theobroma cacao, which is the plant from which we get chocolate, is actually a very underhanded, almost secretive, coded tribute to Sir Hans Sloan. Now, this may or may not be true, but it's a pretty nice story. There's another panel, which is a coded tribute, we think, to another one of the great founders of the collections at the Natural History Museum, and this is Sir Joseph Banks, who as a young man went with Captain Cook on HMS Endeavour, of which this ship on your right is a replica, went on a voyage around the world to observe the transit of Venus, which was a way in which people discovered how to kind of measure longitude, because longitude was quite difficult to measure and was completely essential to navigation, which was part of Britain's greatness at the time, was being able to navigate and send ships all over the place to variously steal things. So Banks went with Cook to Tahiti to measure the transit of Venus, but then they carried on to discover whether there in fact was a great southern continent which was big enough to balance out all the continents in the northern hemisphere. The idea at the time was that there had to be a landmass in the southern part, in the southern hemisphere, that was the same size as the landmass in the northern hemisphere to balance the Earth out so it didn't tip over in space. They didn't really quite understand as much as we understand now about how planets work. So the Endeavour went all over the world, collected in lots of places. The specimens from this voyage are all held in the herbarium of the Natural History Museum today, and the drawings and paintings from that expedition are also held in our collections. And drawings and paintings will become important a little bit later. So one of the panels on the ceiling, again, which I think is a coded tribute to those who built the collections that were then to be housed in this new Natural History Museum, which was opening at the latter part of the 19th century. The voyage of the Endeavour was the latter part of the 18th century. This is a panel of Banksia. It's Banksia speciosa, which is not one of the Banksias that Banks himself collected, but one that was collected by Robert Brown, who was the first keeper of botany of the Natural History collections at the British Museum. So this is something that I think is our coded tributes to people who helped make the collections great. Now, we don't know if this is true or not, but again, it's something that would be great if someone found documentation of this. So those are the panels. That's kind of an example of those panels in the main hall. And this is a slightly out of focus because it's from a long way below picture to show what those panels look like. Is all six of those, each set of six has a tree growing up through it. And each of these trees is different. And each one is labeled with its scientific name. So the ceiling also had an educational purpose. It had a didactic purpose to show people what plants looked like, but also what they were called. Now, if you look around all of these panels, you can see that there's a line across the top part of the ceiling, at the very apex of the ceiling, where the bit comes together at an angle, which is differently colored, and the plants look slightly different. And this is the apex of the ceiling, which was supposed to be more brightly colored. And here are some, here are some of those panels close up. And some of these panels were things that are quite familiar to us, like pineapples and sunflowers. But pineapples were pretty much of a luxury and only available to the very, very few in Victorian Britain. And you can see that each of these is also, many of these this central apex of the whole also have these stencils on them, which are done in gilt. So that means that this top part was actually quite shiny. And if you stand in the bottom, your eyes are drawn up to the apex of the ceiling by these plants growing through 6 panels, and then they come to that top where it's quite shiny. Now these, you notice, don't have labels. They don't have the scientific names. So when my colleague Bob Press and I decided to write a book about the ceiling, because we thought it was absolutely the most amazing thing, and because it was somewhere where botany and plants were featured as in themselves, plants for themselves, not plants as decoration around animals, but plants for themselves, we decided to try to identify all of these panels. Now, pineapples are easy, sunflowers are easy, some of them were quite easy, there's an iris, there's a couple of other things, but there were some that we puzzled over. And we wondered where these images had come from. And because we're botanists who work with dried plants mounted on pieces of paper, like those ones I showed you that Joseph Banks collected, we thought for sure that they came from that sort of origin, that the artist had perhaps looked at herbarium specimens. These are two-dimensional, herbarium specimens are two-dimensional. Now we know quite a bit about where the designs for the terracotta came from. This is Darwin's Rhea, which is in the terracotta on one of the landings, one of the mezzanine galleries in the museum. And we know that this illustration came from Darwin's book, The Voyage of the Beagle. So we know that that was published in about 1830 something. So Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, we know that some of the images came from books. So why we didn't actually think some of these images of plants came from books, I'm not really sure. But one day when I was in the library looking for something completely different, I came across this image on the right, which if you look at it quite carefully isn't actually the same as this image, which is on the ceiling on the left. And this is an image that we had been discussing amongst ourselves is, what is this? What is this plant? And this is a swamp plant called Otelia, which grows all through India and Myanmar and Nepal, all that southern China. And you can see that it has the below water leaves here are lance sword shaped, and here they are sword shaped. The above water leaves are heart shaped, and here they are heart shaped. And the flowers are held in a sort of cup, and here they're held in a sort of cup. So we actually discovered by pure chance one of the sources of some of these images. And there are lots and lots of images which come from this particular book. And here's another one. You can see that it's been altered a little bit, but it's very much based on this image in this book. Now, what this book is a book which is called Plantae Asiatici Rarioris, which was descriptions and figures of select number of unpublished East Indian plants. And it was written by a botanist named Nathaniel Wallach, who lived from 1786 to 1854, and was actually the very first curator of the Indian Museum, and later one of the first directors of what is now the Chandra Bose Botanical Garden in Calcutta, which was called the Calcutta Botanical Garden. Now, Nathaniel Wallach was actually a Dane. He was from Denmark, and he was taken prisoner by the British when the British took over Saharanpur, and they took all the Danish people who were there prisoner. And he was then let out of prison because they discovered that he had expertise in botany and became the curator of the Indian Museum. And you can see here is another image from this book, which is a beautiful, large book full of gorgeous, beautiful images. Now, both the Indian Museum, I'm sure as all of you know, both the Indian Museum and the Chandra Bose Botanical Garden are still important powerhouses of botanical research in India. And Wallach specimens are kept here. They were also sent to the East India Company. I'll come to the East India Company in a minute. Although many of these images were taken from Wallach's book, not all were, and some of the images that were taken from Wallach's book were altered in very interesting and strange ways by the artist who did the original designs for the ceiling. And one of these is a species of piper, or a species of pepper. Now, you know, you've seen the pepper, the little cloves of pepper, which come in curries and in a lot of food. And the flowers of pepper look like this. Here are the fruits, and here are the flowers. And here are the fruits of a pepper, which is called Piper ribiziorum in Wallach's book. But the artist who was doing the ceiling clearly thought that there weren't really good flowers on this picture. So he thought he'd probably just put some in to make it look right. So it's a pepper, but it has complete flowers that are completely wrong. So that was pretty fun to find out and pretty fun to see about. So the artists obviously used their imagination, and they also fit these plants into this square format on the ceiling. Now, as I said, there's the main hall with those 6 panels of plants growing through 6. There's also a set of these panels called archaic on the apex, and we managed to identify all but 2 of them. And I'm still waiting for someone to help me identify those 2. So we'll put a website up, and maybe we can get some people to help us identify that. They come from all over, not just from India, but from all over the world. But above the landing, where the giant sequoia is, in a place where there's a flying staircase that goes up and then comes onto a landing which looks out over the main hall, there's a whole nother set of panels of plants. And these are done in a different way. They're also the same color scheme as the panels of 6 joint panels through which branches grow. But these are designed to be seen from much closer to, because the landing is only about 10 meters from the ceiling. So it's only 10 meters you need to look up to see these illustrations. And these are a combination of both familiar and unfamiliar, and each of these is labeled with a scientific name. So things that would have been familiar to a Victorian visitor from London is something like holly, Ilex aquifolium. That was a commonly cultivated plant. It's still a commonly cultivated plant in Britain and is in many people's gardens. Things that were slightly less familiar is maize, Zea maize, which was only just coming to be cultivated in Europe at the time. This, of course, comes from Central and South America, but was something that was a bit of a novelty in Victorian times. So another very important aspect of this area of the ceiling above the landing is that these seem to be plants, most of which are useful to people. So these are plants of economic importance. And many of these are actually medicinal plants. And if you think about when the museum was open to the public, that was 1881, which is the end of the 19th century, which means that was before we had chemically derived medicines. So all of medicine came from plants. And one of the important ways in which people would cure themselves, and this still happens in many parts of the world, including all over Europe, is through emetics, to purge something that you've eaten or something that's not good for you, to make you get rid of that by throwing it up, essentially. And so a lot of the things on the ceiling are actually emetics. Many people in many parts of the world were given castor oil by their parents as children. I was, for sure. Ricinus communis, the castor bean, is also the source of ricin, which is one of the very potent chemicals which is used in terrorist attacks, and people have been killed with ricin. Aloe succotrina is called bitter aloes. It again is an emetic. So most of the medicinal plants on this part of the ceiling are emetics, and we can't really figure out why that is, but it's quite fun and actually a little bit amusing. There are some really interesting stories behind some of these plants, where there's actually an interesting story behind each of these plants on the ceiling. So I could go on talking to you about this ceiling for days and days, but you'd get bored. So, but you can ask me questions afterwards. One of these is a plant which is, the correct name for it is Blya sapida, named for Captain William Bligh, but it's labeled as Acacia africana on the ceiling. Now, this is a plant which is native to West Africa, But Bly, who was employed by Joseph Banks, actually took plants from Africa to the plantations which were worked by enslaved peoples in the West Indies to be eaten by these people. And actually, acacia is called ackee and is now one of the national fruits of Jamaica, even though it's something that was brought from West Africa to the West Indies by Europeans. This particular plant, Quassia amara, Quassia was named by the Swedish botanist Linnaeus, and it was one of the very few plants that he named for someone who was not a fellow botanist. This was named for a Surinamese escaped enslaved person called Quassi, who was a doctor in Suriname, and this is a plant which is used as an astringent and also as an emetic. So it's one of the very few cases in which a plant was named by Linnaeus or any of the early botanists for an indigenous person and honored an indigenous person. But actually, many of these plants which are in the ceiling are the plants which made the British Empire. So these are plants which were grown by British people in the lands that they colonized and took away from the people who were originally living there. One of these is Nicotiana tabacum, tobacco, which was grown extensively in Eastern North America and was one of the plants which was that was the main cash crop for the early Eastern North American colonies of the British. And another of these is sugarcane, Saccharum officinarum. And I know in another Phytopia talk, there's been a talk about sugarcane. This is sugarcane, which was one of the mainstays of the economy, which was sustained by enslaved people in the West Indies, in the Caribbean. But two other plants on the ceiling are also those powerhouses of making Britain an empire, and Britain having colonies which extended far and wide over the world, which were completely sustained by the economy of agriculture, of growing plants. And one of these was cotton. Now, cotton, at the time that the museum was built, and in the middle part of the 19th century, slavery had been abolished in the United Kingdom, in Great Britain. It was abolished in 1807. But an anonymous American author in 1855 wrote that, and what is England doing all this while, meaning between 1807 and 1855? Having lost her cotton supplies from the West Indies, she was quietly spinning away at American slave labor cotton. The year 1854, instead of finding slavery perishing under the blows it had received, has witnessed the destruction of all the old barriers to its extension. So about a ninth of the British population was employed in the textile industry in the Midlands, which was spinning away at cotton, which was produced by slave labor in the Americas, which were no longer colonies of the British because they declared independence in 1776. But whilst slavery had been abolished in British colonies in the Caribbean, the cotton that was coming into the textile mills of the Midlands was still produced by enslaved people, but in the southern United States. Another very important economic plant for the British at the time that the museum was built, and somewhat earlier, was tea. And the tea monopoly was largely held by the British East India Company. And the East India Company held a monopoly on tea and spices. And fascinatingly, not at the time the museum was built, but slightly before, it had a standing army which was larger than that of the country which ostensibly it served. It was a private company. And the tea which is grown in Darjeeling, the tea in northeastern India, the seeds and technology were smuggled from China by a British botanist called Robert Fortune in the middle of the 19th century. So in a way, the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, both of which had monopolies on teas and spices and controlled large parts of the world, were actually, in a way, a bit like the Google and Amazon of their day. They were companies which were incredibly powerful and held monopolies on particular aspects of things that were essential to the culture at the time. And it's interesting to think that the tea that's grown today is actually a product of that empire, but actually was smuggled itself from China. So the last part of the museum, the museum ceiling that I want to talk about, is that in the North Hall. Now, the North Hall was that part of the museum that was at the top, and you probably can't remember, but way back at the beginning, I showed a map of the floor plan. And there was a bit right at the northern end, which was meant to be a hall of British natural history. So it was supposed to be the gallery in which British natural history was displayed. And on the ceiling there, it looks completely different to the rest of the ceiling in the museum, because the color theme in it is this green color with green backgrounds instead of cream backgrounds like it is in the rest of the ceiling. And you can see here that in the very top, at the apex of the ceiling, there are these heraldic emblems, which I always wondered why. There's one for Ireland, one for England, the Tudor rose, and one for Scotland, which is the thistle. And I always wondered why there wasn't one for Wales. And someone said to me, no, it's because there was never a kingdom of Wales. It was always a principality. So Wales is not represented in the heraldic emblems of the museum. So that's another kind of like obscure piece of history that's built into the building itself. Now, the plants which are depicted on the ceiling are absolutely beautiful. And of all the places, I think this is one of my favorite parts of the museum. The plants here are on green backgrounds, and they are just in one color. They're in this kind of slightly dirty brownish color, but the colors are picked out in both gilt, which is gold, and silver gilt, which is silver. So this is metal pounded very, very thin and then laid onto the plaster as the painting was done. And these are sort of native British plants like honeysuckle and bistort, and things that people might have recognized had they been out in the countryside. There are also quite a few medicinal plants on this part of the ceiling as well, one of which is Datura stramonium, which is the Jimson weed, which is something that's native to South America, but was very, very early taken all over the world by early people who were sailing, whether they were European, Chinese, I don't know, but it came very early into Asia and is called Datura by Linnaeus after the Dutras, which were the whirling dervishes of Asia. Digitalis is the foxglove, which is the source of the drug called digitoxin, which is something which is used to control control heart problems. But at the time that the museum was built, this was a drug which had only just been discovered. So this was something new and exciting, a new medical discovery, which was depicted on the ceiling. For us now, it's pretty old hat, but at the time, it was brand new. So you can see that some of these images, there was a story that was true at the time that the museum was built. And there's also a story for our time. So the stories associated with these particular plants and the narratives that go with them change through time. And if you look at the images I've showed you, around them all are all of these decorative images. So all of the images are surrounded with frames, which are almost geometric. They're geometric in their design. And there's a lot of geometry in the design of the museum, all of which I think serves to focus the eye in a way on the images of the organisms themselves. It's true in the columns which hold up the ceiling. It's true in the borders in the main hall, borders in the north hall, and in also the stained glass windows, which are at the very end of the building. So all of these decorative elements pull together to actually emphasize the images of the organisms. And these are a few more of those decorative elements. And the VR stands for Queen Victoria, who was queen at the time that the museum was built. So this highly decorated ceiling has lasted for a very long time, since 1881. And it was painted on plaster, so it's plaster on lath and plaster. So it's actually suspended from the ceiling with straw behind. So it's an incredibly fragile thing. So it's actually quite surprising that all of the ceilings, all of these beautiful painted ceilings, actually survived the Second World War when various incendiary bombs went through the ceiling of the Natural History Museum on the 10th of September in 1940. So this is the ceiling of the east wing of the museum, that bit where it's decorated with extinct animals along here. And 3 incendiary bombs went through, but because it was Britain, it was raining, and so nothing burned. But there was a lot of damage. But in fact, lotus seeds that were 1,000 years old germinated because of the wet. And many of the sheets were actually damaged, but water damaged. And each of those herbarium sheets are now labeled with a little label which says sheet damaged by enemy action on 10th of September 1940. And so it's really interesting to come across those herbarium specimens working in the collections and realize that what that particular dried plant on a piece of paper must have gone through. But the bombing of London also had other stories to tell that are associated with the Natural History Museum ceilings. This is something called Chemerion Angustifolium. It used to be called Epilobium, and here it is on the ceiling of the North Hall. And at the time that the museum was built in 1881, this was a very rare plant in the north of England. So it was there as an example of something rare that was part of the British flora. That's what we think. But after the bombing of London, Chemerion colonized all of the bomb sites in London and became an incredibly common plant of disturbed ground throughout southern Britain. So these are specimens which were collected specifically on the flora. They were collected specifically on the bomb sites of London in the 1950s to record what plants had come in on this ground that had been so heavily disturbed during the massive bombings of London in the 1940s. So each of these panels on the ceiling has a story to tell, both a story to tell of the day that it was put up, but a story to tell today as well. And to me, that's one of the really nice things and the exciting things about the plants on the ceiling is they're not a static set of images. They're a set of images that can lead us off into all kinds of explorations of what plants have meant to people, what plants meant to people then, what plants mean to people now, and perhaps also what plants might mean to people in the future. Because just as the British Empire was completely sustained by plants, the economy of plants, plants will also be incredibly important to us to create a sustainable future going forward. So I'm so happy that Hope the whale has been hung in the central hall. She replaced the Diplodocus dinosaur, which was on the ground, because now as visitors coming into this massive space look up to see Hope the whale, they also look up and see all of those plants on the ceiling and can maybe connect a little bit with the flora and the plants, which are so important to us now and also in the future. So thank you very, very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Sandy. That was absolutely brilliant. That I think we were all in the museum for a bit there.
I hope so. I hope so. It's such an amazing building. It's such an amazing building.
I think we were transported to the Great Hall for the last 40 minutes or so. And I think everyone's imagination has really been captured, especially by those beautiful images, right? And I think they were really, really lovely. And I'd like to encourage the audience to share their questions in the Q&A box.
Also comments. And yeah, I mean, I learn something about this every single day. I learn something about the building and the history of the plants. And there's a couple that I still don't know what they are. And I just carry them around with me and show them to all the botanists I know and say, what is this? Maybe they're made up. Maybe there's something that the artist made up. That's not beyond the realm of possibility, is it?
Yes. So I have a couple of questions to start off the session, maybe. So the first thing is, it's amazing how the architectural style or how the museum was designed inside is so showcases how central plants were to the human perspective at that point of time, right? Mm-hmm. It was everything from industry to medicine to science to, it all reflects on how central they were to our lives. And is it almost the fact that if we look at architecture around us now, or how museums and even science museums that are built today don't reflect that similar sort of centrality of plants? Is it something that suggests plants have changed? The role of plants in our lives has changed? That
actually is a really good idea, and I think that may be true. This is an extremely unusual building. It's the first building that Waterhouse built that was completely clad in terracotta and so heavily decorated. It was so, so heavily decorated. And one of the things that I think, you know, that quote I showed of the reviewer who said that the animals were grotesque and kind of ridiculous, and is that actually he didn't comment on the plants at all. And I think it's because these plants look very much like the sort of William Morris type. They were very, there was the sort of arts and crafts movement sense of design, which was all about plants as well. So these are very reminiscent of that. But it could also be that, you know, the fact that a lot of architecture doesn't have anything to do with the natural world at all anymore actually means that we see our lives as separate from that. And that to me is interesting. And I mean, you know, the phenomenon of it's called plant blindness, or some people call it plant awareness deficit, or whatever we want to call it. The fact that when we see a lion sitting in a tree, what do we see? We see the lion, we don't see the tree. And that's true of a lot of us, but actually we hardly see anything other than vertebrates, really. So when people talk about animals, what they mean is vertebrates. And thinking about the diversity of animal life, it's mostly all about insects and worms.
That's true.
But plants are totally central to the functioning of all ecosystems. Without plants, we wouldn't have air to breathe. We wouldn't have, you know, ecosystem, the water retention of soil would be wrong, and it is important, you know. And I just see in the chat that someone has said if plants were introduced to young learners, it would go a long way to respecting plants, and I absolutely agree that introducing plants as of equal importance with animals is super important to us taking nature as something holistic, more than just a collection of things which we can put into boxes, which, I mean, I'm a taxonomist, so what do? I put things in boxes, you know, so I'm saying that I shouldn't do what I do. But actually, I think for us to appreciate nature and become advocates. I mean, if the museum's mission is to create advocates for the planet. And so if we're going to become advocates, we need to see the whole, we need to see things in the round, and we need to depict them in the round as well. And that means seeing all parts of it. So I totally agree that introducing young people to plants, and actually kids are really into plants. I have a granddaughter, and she spends her whole time stroking mosses. I mean, she just because they're little, you know, they're down at her level, and she just strokes them. She loves them, you know. And so I think maybe we beat it out of kids. I don't know.
So we have another question, a couple of questions actually. I'm going to club this one. This one is from Rajvi and Meera, and they're both asking about how how the museum has preserved these structures. One, how the terracotta hasn't crumbled yet, or what are the kinds of paints that were used that ensure these things have survived the test of time?
Well, that's a super good question, because the terracotta is amazing. I mean, the terracotta, you know, so if you build with stone, you can put one block on top of another, and if it doesn't fit quite right, you can kind of adjust it. If you build with terracotta, it has to fit perfectly, like a jigsaw puzzle, first time. So every single one of those blocks had to be perfect before it's a facing. So it's brick behind, it's like a facing. And it was just extremely well, it's very solid material, terracotta. It's incredibly solid. It's baked clay. I mean, it's baked. So it's like pottery, but it's quite thick. I mean, it's thick. It's sort of like, I don't know, that thick. And around the columns, at the bases of the columns, where trolleys get taken for catering, or they get taken for this, we've put copper cladding to protect the terracotta down there. But it's extraordinary. It was true that some of it had, in the 1990s, I think, we re-roofed one of the wings, and it turned out that some of the big the lions at the top, the base had rotted away, had crumbled. And what's extraordinary is the molds for the original terracotta still exist, and so a new terracotta was cast from the old molds and put up on the western side of the museum. So when you look, maybe we should go back to that first image and see if you can figure out which of the ones is the new one. which one is the new one, because it looks a bit kind of paler than the others, but it fits in perfectly. So there has been some damage, and there is some damage, but it's partly being looked after, and it doesn't degrade with the acid rain in the same way that marble does. So we're lucky in that way. And the paints, now we don't really know, again, because we don't really know what paints were used, or I mean, we speculate that it was done from the scaffolding, from some of the kind of partial evidence that we've put together. But you know, we don't know. And I know that the woman whose picture where she was on the scaffolding, the modern woman, people came from the Courtauld Gallery, so the art museum in London, and looked at the pigments and tried to reconstruct the pigments in the paints when some damage was repaired, when the whale was hung and Hinsey Hall was redone very recently. So we also monitor it very carefully for cracks, because one of the things that could happen is a crack could develop across one of those panels and the whole thing could unkey and fall down. And fortunately, touch wood, that's never happened. So some little pieces of plaster have fallen out, but not many. But it's really stood the test of time, I think, which is testament to Waterhouse and his builders' skill in building that building. So we try our hardest, and we just hope that nothing happens. We're so lucky that nothing happened to the ceilings during the Second World War. I mean, can you imagine all those ceilings and not a single one was damaged?
I have another question here from Shruti, which is interesting. So it asks whether the purpose of putting these the illustrations of the plants on the ceiling, whether the purpose of highlighting plants was to spur a discussion among visitors to the museum and educate them about the sheer variety, or was this ever the purpose for doing it?
I think that's probably right. I think that because they've got the scientific names on them, that it was partly didactic, so it was partly about education, but I think it was also for beauty. So it served this kind of dual purpose. And also, I think there was a sort of triumphalism in it as well. You know, those plants that built the British Empire. I think there's a certain amount of triumphalism in the ceiling as well, which was very much how Britain felt about itself at the time. Mm-hmm. We certainly don't feel like that anymore, but you know, it sort of is interesting to look back and think about, and because we don't have any documentation about why they chose the plants they did, you know, what it was supposed to mean. Was it supposed to mean anything? You know, we know much more about the terracotta itself, and the terracotta was supposed to celebrate the diversity of animal life, and there was a certain amount of, you know, extinct things on one side and extant things on the other, and some of that is some of it's good and some of it's not quite so good. And one of the really cool one of the ones I love about the terracotta, and it's in the shop. So if anybody ever comes to London, if anybody's ever allowed to go to London again, in the shop there's a coelacanth on one of the pillars. You know, the coelacanth, which is the big fish that was discovered in the Mozambique Channel. In the 1960s, the coelacanth was only known from fossils until the 1960s. So its depiction is on the extinct side of the museum, and now we know it's extant. And the Seychelles gecko, which is the little lizard from the Seychelles, is on the extant side of the museum, the living side of the museum, and it went extinct about 10 years after the museum was built. So there's a couple of like switcheroos, which, you know, we're not going to change nobody's going to change the design, the decoration of the building to make it completely accurate. And there's other stuff that's not quite right. But I think that a lot of the imagery was kind of the imagination of the architect and his idea of what a natural history museum should be. But also the museum was very much seen by Owen as a place for people to learn. So I do think it had an educational aspect.
We'll just take two more questions before we close the session. There are two questions which relate to the artist, and maybe you could tell us a bit more about the artist who painted the panels themselves.
Well, I can't really. That's the thing, is we don't really know anything about him. He was called Charles James Lee, and they were a company called Best and Lee, and they were friends of Waterhouse. So Waterhouse was a Quaker and lived he was from Manchester in the north of England. And there was a whole many Quaker people actually were artisans at the time. And I know that Best and Lee, the company Best and Lee, did a lot of work for Waterhouse, including decorating his own house, which was a place called Yattenden. And we know that Charles Lee painted the paintings. We don't know if he did the original drawings. The person who's written a book about the terracotta thinks that Waterhouse probably did the drawings himself, because he did all the sketches for all the rest of the decoration of the museum. And it would be really odd if he just left some part of it to somebody else. But they would have been done small. And then what would have happened is they would have been scaled up, you know, in the same way that the drawings that are on the Sistine Chapel get scaled up, and then they get pricked, and charcoal goes in, we don't really know, because I got up about 2 weeks ago. I got taken in one of those cherry picker things that goes way up high, but it only went 20 meters above the floor, so I was still 10 meters away from the ceiling, so I couldn't really see whether there were like remnants of charcoal on the plaster or what. But but we think he did it. He would have done it from drawings which were kind of put onto the ceiling and then transferred in some kind of way. And then I think we just don't really know. But he's called Charles Lee. He was.
So my last question before we close today's session is, so this is the Natural History Museum of the past, almost, right? In a sense, the ceiling captures how people thought about what the museum was doing at that point of time and what role it should play. And today, given both the changing global scenario and the climate crisis, the Anthropocene, everything that we're going through, how do you see the role of the Natural History Museum and its relationship to plants changing going forward?
Well, actually, I think museums like ours, museums like the Natural History Museum, have a very unique and very important part to play, not only through the research that we do about, you know, where plants occur or where animals occur, and threats to them and their populations and what they are and all that other kind of stuff, but also in using our expertise to actually help people become advocates for the planet. So we use our collections and expertise to help our visitors, you know, understand or connect with nature in a way that can help them see that there is something that each one of us can do. Each and every one of us can do something to help the rest of life on Earth. And we have a very big project which is called the Urban Nature Project, which is to redesign all of our gardens. So this is inside the museum. So outside the museum there are gardens. They're not big like the botanical gardens, but they're small gardens. And part of thinking about that is linking up some of the stories from these plants inside the museum with stories outside the museum, and thinking about, again, as you say, how our relationship with plants has changed, but also how plants have been important to humans in history, and also to think about, you know, how museums have changed in the way that they interact with other peoples as well. So other knowledge systems, for example. So you know, different types of medicine, different types of interacting with the world. I think it's no longer true, as was true in the Victorian times, that people in museums like the Natural History Museum think that our knowledge system is the only knowledge system. I think it's much more important to us now to think about how to intersect between these different knowledge systems and actually learn from each other in a way that will actually contribute to sustainability of the planet. Because unless all of us advocate for nature, it won't survive.
Absolutely.
It's very depressing. It's a very depressing end, but it's great because we can all do it. And each of us, as somebody said in the beginning, each of us can go out and take that, you know, plants are important message, whatever we are, whether we're an educator, whether we're a scientist, whether we're a lawyer or a doctor or just anybody, we can all talk about how plants are important. And I think that's how we'll become to appreciate them more again.
Absolutely. It's about re-looking at things, right? Stepping back and looking at them, really.
And it's looking through it's looking at them through different eyes, looking at them through other people's eyes, and thinking about how those stories change as well, how those narratives about plants and about everything, narratives about everything change through time, and to look back critically or uncritically or happily, or everything is good and bad. And so it's looking back and thinking those narratives and rethinking. But I think the one that we really need to keep right up there front and center is how important plants are for us, not just now, but into the future.
I think that's a brilliant way to sum it all up. And thank you so much, Sandy.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I love talking about that ceiling. I just love it.
I think we were really taken somewhere else throughout the entire session. And
me too. I've been in my house for months.
No, it's absolutely lovely. And I think now we will make a point to always look up the next time we walk in somewhere. You never know what you might miss if you don't.
Exactly.
So that's really lovely. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And Sandy, I hope to see you. I hope to work with you again in the future. And
again, I'll be there. I'll be there in India soon, one day.
And I'd like to invite all our guests to please explore the exhibition on the Phytopia website. We're going to close on Sunday, so please take this chance to explore the lovely exhibits that are there. Thank you all and have a good night. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.